The wind still moves across the old cemeteries of America the same way it once swept across the dusty plains of the Wild West. Beneath weathered headstones and fatting names lie the men who taught the world what a cowboy was supposed to be. Their faces once filled cinema screens. Their voices echoed in saloons, deserts, and small frontier towns built entirely for film. Today their stories rest in silence, marked only by stone, earth, and memory. This is not a story about death. It is a story about where legends finally came to rest. The Western film created heroes larger than life, men who rode alone against injustice, who spoke little, and whose moral codes were simple but unbreakable. These actors became symbols of courage, independence, and a fatting American frontier. But even legends must one day dismount their horses for the last time. This documentary traces the final resting places of legendary Western film actors, exploring not only where they are buried but why their graves still matter. Each grave is a chapter, each cemetery a forgotten stage. At the dawn of Hollywood, Westerns were not prestige films. They were fast, affordable productions made to satisfy audiences hungry for adventure. Yet from these humble beginnings emerged stars whose influence would shape American cinema forever. The early Western actor was more than an entertainer, he became a cultural myth. These men were often former soldiers, ranch hands, or athletes. Their physical presence mattered, authenticity mattered. The camera demanded faces that looked like they had been shaped by sun, wind, and hardship. As Western films gained popularity in the 1910s and 1920s, audiences began to recognize certain names. These actors became the first cinematic cowboys, trailblazers whose images would define the genre for generations. William S. Hart was not just an actor, he was the first Western film icon to insist on realism. Unlike others who romanticized the Old West, Hart portrayed cowboys as flawed, often violent men struggling with morality. Hart starred in more than 70 Western films during the silent era. His characters were hardened gunmen seeking redemption, stories far darker than the cheerful Westerns that followed. When Hart died in 1946, his era had already passed. Sound films had replaced silence. New faces dominated the screen. William S. Hart is buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. His grave is modest, almost unnoticed among thousands of others. There is no statue of a cowboy, no horse, just a marker bearing the name of the man who invented the serious Western hero. His grave reflects the quiet dignity of a man who shaped a genre and then stepped away from fame. Where William S. Hart brought realism, Tom Mix brought spectacle. Mix was flamboyant, athletic, and larger than life. His westerns featured impossible stunts, dazzling costumes, and clear lines between good and evil. Tom Mix didn't just ride horses, he performed acrobatics on them. He became one of Hollywood's first true superstars, earning enormous salaries and international fame. His cowboy persona was clean, heroic, and fearless. For many children of the 1920s, Tom Mix was not an actor, he was a real-life hero. In 1940, Tom Mix died suddenly in a car accident in Arizona. The road he traveled that day passed through desert landscapes similar to those he once dominated on screen. Tom Mix is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, a cemetery that holds many Hollywood legends. His grave is marked with dignity, but nearby stands a larger tribute, Tom Mix Wash, a roadside memorial marking the place of his death. His resting place bridges two worlds, the illusion of cinema and the harsh reality of the desert. Harry Carey Sr. was not flashy, he was not glamorous, but he was essential. Carey worked closely with director John Ford and helped define the emotional core of Western storytelling. His characters were weary, human, and deeply grounded. Carey represented the aging cowboy, the man who understood that the frontier was disappearing. He died in 1947, just as Westerns were entering their most iconic era. Final resting place. Harry Carey Sr. is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. His grave lies among palm trees and silent paths surrounded by the history he helped create. His son, Harry Carey Jr., would later continue the Western legacy, appearing in many classic films. The graves of early Western actors are rarely visited by crowds. There are no daily ceremonies, no guided tour, yet their influence lives on in every Western that followed. These men created the language of the genre. The Lone Rider, the moral struggle, the final showdown. Their graves mark the end of the frontier's first cinematic chapter. But the Western was far from finished. As America entered a new era, a new kind of cowboy would rise, stronger, quieter, and immortalized forever on the silver screen. The Western did not fade with the silent era. It transformed. As America moved through the Great Depression and into World War II, audiences needed heroes who felt solid, dependable, and morally certain. The Western responded by creating its golden age, a period when the cowboy became a national symbol and Western actors became permanent legends. This era produced faces so recognizable that even decades after their deaths, their silhouettes alone are enough to identify them. These men did not simply act in Westerns, they became the Western. And when their final scenes ended, they were laid to rest in places that now quietly guard the history of an entire genre. No name is more inseparable from the Western film than John Wayne. Born Marion Robert Morrison, Wayne did not rise quickly. He worked for years in minor roles, often uncredited, learning the rhythm of the genre from the ground up. His breakthrough came in 1939 with Stagecoach, directed by John Ford, a film that reshaped the Western and launched Wayne into immortality. Wayne's characters were defined by restraint. He did not speak much. He stood firm. His presence alone conveyed authority. Whether playing lawmen, soldiers, or aging gunfighters, Wayne embodied a sense of order in a chaotic frontier. He appeared in more than 140 films, many of them Westerns, and remained a dominant figure for over 4 decades. When John Wayne died in 1979 after a long battle with cancer, the world did not simply lose an actor, it lost a symbol. John Wayne was cremated, and his ashes were placed in the Pacific View Memorial Park Cemetery in Corona del Mar, California. His grave is marked not by a towering statue, but by a modest plaque bearing his name and a quotation that reflects his deeply personal beliefs. The simplicity of his resting place contrasts sharply with the magnitude of his legacy. Visitors often stand quietly, understanding that no monument could fully capture what he represented. If John Wayne represented strength, Gary Cooper represented conscience. Cooper's Western characters were not invincible. They hesitated, they doubted, they struggled with responsibility. In High Noon, Cooper portrayed a lawman abandoned by his community, a story that became one of the most powerful moral allegories in film history. Unlike many Western stars, Cooper avoided exaggeration. His performances felt natural, almost understated. He allowed silence to speak louder than dialogue. His death in 1961 marked the loss of a man whose influence extended far beyond Westerns. Gary Cooper is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, the same cemetery that holds several other Golden Age legends. His grave is dignified, understated, and surrounded by carefully maintained grounds. It is fitting that Cooper rests in a place of calm order, reflecting the quiet strength he brought to every role. Randolph Scott's Western career spanned decades. Tall, lean, and intense, Scott often played men driven by justice or revenge. His collaborations with director Bud Boetticher produced some of the most psychologically complex Westerns ever filmed. These were not simple tales of good versus evil. They explored obsession, regret, and moral compromise. Scott retired at the peak of his popularity, choosing dignity over decline. Randolph Scott is buried at Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina, his home state. His grave is far removed from Hollywood's glamour, resting instead in a quiet southern cemetery. The distance feels intentional. Scott lived privately and left the world on his own terms. Henry Fonda was unique among Western actors because he could convincingly portray both righteousness and cruelty. In My Darling Clementine, Fonda's Wyatt Earp was calm, principled, and human. But in Once Upon a Time in the West, his portrayal of a cold-blooded killer shocked audiences who had come to associate him with moral authority. Fonda's versatility allowed the Western to grow beyond simple heroism. He died in 1982, leaving behind a legacy that influenced generations of actors. Henry Fonda is buried at Forest Hills Cemetery in Nebraska near his birthplace. Like many Western legends, he returned home in death. His grave stands as a reminder that even Hollywood's greatest figures are ultimately shaped by their origins. Audie Murphy was already a legend before he ever stepped onto a Western set. As the most decorated American soldier of World War II, Murphy carried real courage into his acting career. His Western roles often reflected his own experiences, men haunted by violence, struggling to adapt to peace. Murphy's life ended tragically in a plane crash in 1971. Audie Murphy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most visited grave sites there. His white headstone remains deliberately unadorned following his personal request. Among presidents and generals, Murphy's grave reminds visitors that the Western hero was sometimes not a performance, but a reality. Forest Lawn, Hollywood Forever, Arlington, these cemeteries have become silent museums of Western history. Unlike film sets, they do not recreate the past, they preserve it. Each grave represents a chapter in the genre's evolution. The confident lawman, the reluctant hero, the aging gunfighter. Together, they form a map of American storytelling. By the late 1950s, the Western dominated American cinema and television. Yet even at its height, change was coming, audiences were evolving, moral certainty was fading. Across the Atlantic, a new vision of the Western was about to emerge, darker, harsher, and more ambiguous. And with it would come a new generation of legends and new graves far from Hollywood. By the early 1960s, the American Western was losing its certainty. The frontier had been conquered too many times, the heroes had spoken too clearly, the lines between right and wrong had become predictable. Audiences, shaped by war, political tension, and social change, were no longer satisfied with clean morality and familiar faces. The Western did not die. It crossed the ocean. In Europe, particularly in Italy and Spain, a darker version of the frontier was reborn. These films would later be called spaghetti westerns, a term once dismissive, now legendary. They introduced a new kind of cowboy, morally ambiguous, emotionally distant, and often driven by survival rather than honor. The actors who defined this era became international icons, and when their journeys ended, many were laid to rest far from the deserts they made famous. No figure bridges the American Western and the spaghetti Western more completely than Clint Eastwood. Before Italy, Eastwood was a struggling television actor. After Italy, he was a global symbol. His portrayal of the man with no name redefined masculinity on screen: quiet, observant, lethal, and emotionally unreadable. Unlike many Western legends, Eastwood lived to see his influence acknowledged. He became a director, shaping Westerns that reflected aging, regret, and consequence. As of this narrative, Clint Eastwood remains alive, a living monument to the genre's evolution. His presence serves as a reminder that not every legend has yet reached their final resting place. But many of his contemporaries already have. Lee Van Cleef did not resemble traditional Western heroes. His sharp features, narrow eyes, and intense gaze made him unforgettable. In American Westerns, he often played villains or secondary roles. In Italy, he became a star. Van Cleef's characters were dangerous, calculating, and emotionally cold, perfectly suited to the moral complexity of spaghetti westerns. He died in 1989 after a long illness. Final resting place. Lee Van Cleef is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, California. Despite his international fame, his grave is understated. Visitors often leave behind small tokens, coins, cigarillos, or handwritten notes, silent tributes to a man whose presence could dominate a scene without a single word. If Clint Eastwood represented silence and Lee Van Cleef precision, Eli Wallach represented chaos. In the good, the bad, and the ugly, Wallach's character Tuco was unpredictable, emotional, and painfully human. He laughed, cried, begged, and betrayed. He brought humanity into a world otherwise ruled by violence. Wallach lived a long life, dying in 2014 at the age of 98. Eli Wallach is buried at Kensico Cemetery in Valhalla, New York. His grave is far removed from the arid landscapes of his most famous roles. It is a reminder that cinema often places us in worlds that are not our own, and that the actors themselves eventually return home. Charles Bronson's Western presence was built on silence and endurance. His characters were not eloquent, they were physical, relentless, and deeply internalized. Bronson became a star in European Westerns after being overlooked in Hollywood. His success abroad mirrored the genre's transformation: grittier, slower, more violent. He died in 2003. Charles Bronson is buried at Brownsville Cemetery in Vermont, a rural and quiet place that reflects his famously private life. There is no grand marker, no cinematic symbolism, only a name and dates as unadorned as the characters he portrayed. Not all spaghetti Western legends were American. Giuliano Gemma became one of Italy's most beloved Western stars, appearing in dozens of films that shaped European interpretations of the genre. Gemma's characters were more playful and agile, blending humor with action. He represented a uniquely European view of the cowboy, less mythic, more adaptable. He died in 2013 following a car accident. Giuliano Gemma is buried in Rome, Italy, honored by fans who recognize his contribution to cinema history. His grave attracts visitors from across Europe, many of whom grew up watching his films dubbed into multiple languages. Many spaghetti westerns were filmed in Spain's Almeria region. Today, abandoned sets still stand, wooden facades collapsing under the sun. Nearby cemeteries hold technicians, stuntmen, and supporting actors whose names never appeared above the title. Their contributions remain invisible, yet essential. The Western was no longer purely American, it had become global. Spaghetti Westerns stripped away idealism. They showed violence as exhausting, survival as uncertain, heroes as temporary. These films influenced directors worldwide, from Hollywood to Asia. The Western was reborn not as nostalgia but as critique. Yet even this era would eventually fade. As the 1970s progressed, the Western moved toward reflection rather than rebellion. The legends grew older. Their final roles spoke not of conquest but of endings. And once again, graves began to fill, this time with men who understood that the frontier had truly closed. When ready, say. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the Western was no longer about discovery. It was about reckoning. The frontier had been conquered, mythologized, and finally questioned. The men who once rode with certainty now returned to the screen as older figures haunted by violence, aware of their own obsolescence. These Westerns were slower, quieter, and often tragic. The actors who carried this final era were no less legendary. They did not portray the beginning of the West, they portrayed its end. And when their final roles concluded, they left behind graves that mark not only personal endings, but the closing chapters of an entire cinematic tradition. James Stewart entered Westerns later in his career, bringing with him a vulnerability rarely seen in the genre before. Unlike earlier heroes, Stewart's characters were emotionally exposed. They hesitated, they doubted, they broke. Films like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and Winchester '73 explored the psychological cost of violence and the lies behind legends. Stewart's presence transformed the Western into something introspective, almost confessional. He died in 1997 at the age of 89. James Stewart is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, alongside many Hollywood icons. His grave is simple, reflecting the humility he was known for throughout his life. Standing before it, visitors often feel the weight of a man who showed that heroes could be afraid and still matter. Kirk Douglas brought intensity and confrontation to the Western. His characters were restless, often angry men who challenged authority rather than upheld it. In Lonely Are the Brave, Douglas portrayed a modern cowboy resisting a world that no longer had room for him. The film felt less like a Western and more like a funeral for the frontier itself. Douglas lived to be 103, long enough to witness his films become historical artifacts rather than entertainment. Kirk Douglas is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, a cemetery known for its compact layout and concentration of film history. His grave rests among fellow artists who reshaped American cinema through rebellion rather than tradition. Burt Lancaster's physical presence once defined strength and athleticism. In his later westerns, that strength became a burden. Films like Valdez is Coming and The Professionals explored aging, betrayal, and the cost of survival. Lancaster's characters were often men left behind by progress. He died in 1994. Burt Lancaster is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, not far from Kirk Douglas. Their proximity in death mirrors their shared role in redefining the Western as something morally complex. Director Sam Peckinpah changed the Western by exposing its brutality. His films did not celebrate violence, they mourned it. Actors like William Holden, Ernest Borgnine, and Robert Ryan portrayed aging outlaws who understood they were already ghosts. Holden's role in The Wild Bunch depicted a man aware that his time had passed. The film's final violence felt ritualistic, almost sacrificial. William Holden is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, joining the growing congregation of Western history. Borgnine brought physicality and humanity to his Western roles. He died in 2012. Final resting place. Ernest Borgnine is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills. Ryan often played morally ambiguous figures, men capable of both cruelty and compassion. Final resting place. Robert Ryan is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. These men collectively represented the Western's final act, a genre no longer pretending to be noble. By the early 1980s, Westerns became rare. When they appeared, they were elegies. Actors like Gene Hackman and Clint Eastwood portrayed retired gunfighters forced to confront past sins. Unforgiven did not glorify killing, it dismantled it. The Western had turned inward. It was no longer about the land, it was about memory. Westwood Village, Forest Lawn, these cemeteries became the final resting places of men who played the West from its birth to its collapse. They are not frontier cemeteries, they are urban, orderly, and carefully maintained symbols of the modern world that replaced the frontier. The irony is unavoidable. The men who once rode across open plains now rest beneath manicured lawns. The Western did not vanish, it learned how to end. Its final era taught audiences that legends are constructed, that violence leaves scars, and that progress always erases something valuable. And yet, even in decline, the Western created one final gift: reflection. The story, however, does not end with the actors alone. Because legends do not rest only in graves. They rest in memory. And that memory still rides. End of Part 4. The Western did not disappear. It settled into the ground. Across America and beyond, beneath marble, granite, and simple earth, lie the men who once defined an entire way of seeing the world. Their graves are quiet now, but they are not silent. They continue to speak through memory, through film, and through the myths that refuse to fade. To walk among these resting places is to walk through the final chapter of the frontier. Graves are not merely endings, they are points of preservation. Each Western actor's resting place holds more than a body. It holds a time when the world believed in clarity, when justice rode on horseback and the horizon promised possibility. These men helped build a shared imagination at a moment when America, and later the world, needed simple moral stories. Visitors who seek out these graves are rarely casual tourists. They are historians, film scholars, lifelong fans, or solitary individuals drawn by nostalgia. Many stand silently, not taking photographs, understanding instinctively that these are not celebrity graves, they are cultural landmarks. The Western actor did not simply entertain, he reassured. In uncertain times, he represented order. What began as an American genre became universal. Japanese samurai films, European crime cinema, modern action films all carry the Western's DNA. The lone warrior, the moral code, the final confrontation. Actors buried in California, New York, Nebraska, Vermont, Italy, and beyond unknowingly shaped storytelling across continents. Their influence reached far beyond the dusty towns they portrayed. Even today, filmmakers return to Western structures when exploring justice, revenge, or isolation. The genre did not die. It evolved. Not every Western legend rests beneath a famous name. Stuntmen who fell from horses, supporting actors who filled saloons and gunfights, crew members who built towns that stood only long enough to be filmed, many lie in unmarked or little-known graves. Their absence from history books does not diminish their importance. Without them, the Western would have remained an idea instead of a living world. Their anonymity reflects the reality of the frontier itself, where many lived bravely and died unknown. Hollywood cemeteries function like permanent sets. Forest Lawn, Westwood Village, Hollywood Forever, Arlington, Kensico, Greenwood, Elmwood. Each one preserves a different chapter of the Western's life cycle. Birth, rise, transformation, decline, reflection. These places are carefully maintained, unlike the abandoned film sets in the desert. Civilization has reclaimed the land just as it reclaimed the frontier. The Western exists now only through memory and through stone. The Western actor gave audiences something rare, a moral mirror. Through these films, people explored justice, loneliness, sacrifice, and the price of violence. The genre allowed viewers to imagine a world where choices mattered deeply and consequences were unavoidable. Modern cinema may be louder, faster, and more complex, but the Western remains its moral ancestor. The graves remind us that stories are carried by people, and people are finite. There is a moment that comes when standing at these graves. The world grows quiet, not dramatically, not emotionally, simply still. You realize that the men who once filled wide screens now occupy a space no larger than the earth above them. Their power has shifted from presence to memory. And memory, unlike flesh, does not decay. The Western hero always rode into the sunset. That image was never about disappearance. It was about transition. The sunset marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another unseen one. The same is true for the men buried beneath these stones. They are no longer performing, but they are still teaching. Through grainy film reels, digital restorations, and quiet cemetery paths, they continue to remind us of who we were and who we once believed we could be. One day, every frontier closes. The land becomes settled, the stories become legends, the legends become names on stone. Yet somewhere, a young viewer still watches an old Western for the first time. Somewhere, a lone figure rides across the screen. Somewhere, justice is chosen over fear. And in that moment, the graves of legendary Western film actors do not mark an ending. They mark a beginning.